That morning the sky dawned clear, but the air carried a melancholy that was difficult to explain. As the city woke up in its usual hurry, amid honking horns, hurried footsteps and faces immersed in cell phone screens, a small figure walked slowly along the sidewalk. Her bare feet felt the roughness of the ground, but she didn't complain. Her eyes, too big for her thin face, carried a tiredness that did not match her age. She was only 9 years old, but the look of someone who had lived too long without. A lap, without bread and without answers. She wore a threadbare dress clearly inherited from another child, with patched seams and frayed hem. In his arms he carried a bundle of simple flowers, picked from other people's gardens and vacant lots. They were not sophisticated bouquets, but there was beauty in them, a living, natural beauty, which the girl cared for with surprising affection. She cleaned each petal gently, straightened the stems, and whenever a flower withered too much, she left it aside with regret, like someone who loses a friend. She walked with small steps, dodging people who didn't even notice her presence. It was as if the world had decided not to see her. That child was already invisible, not by choice, but because the world simply gets used to ignoring what hurts. People hurried by, going in and out of stores, talking on the phone, discussing business, and deciding on lunch for the day while she just walked. He walked not for lack of what to do, but because there was nowhere to go. I just knew that I had to sell those flowers, because with the money I might get a piece of bread, maybe even two if someone was generous. She did not ask for alms. He never asked. Since he learned to speak, he has heard that no one values those who only extend a hand. So she offered something. It offered beauty, color, perfume, and hope. Its flowers did not come from flower shops, but were alive, full of meaning. Even without knowing the scientific name of each one, she knew how to hold them, how to present them with respect. He treated them as if they were precious gifts, because, in fact, they were. There was a special kind of strength in that girl, a silent force, which did not come from muscles or screams, but from resilience. Even with her stomach growling, she smiled shyly as she offered a flower. Even after hearing no for the 10th time in half an hour, she wouldn't give up. It wasn't pride, it was survival. Every flower sold meant more than coins. It meant one more chance to continue. That day she walked through the streets of an upscale neighborhood, where the sidewalks were wide and the cars were imported. The buildings had security guards at the door, cameras in every corner, and mirrored facades that reflected their fragile image, creating the cruelest contrast, the reflection of a neglected childhood in luxury windows. Still, she didn't feel out of place. I just felt that I needed to try there too. After all, the flowers were beautiful, and maybe someone would see that. She approached the establishments cautiously, without invading, without insisting. He stopped at the door, offered the flowers in a low but firm voice. "Fresh flowers, do you want one?" was what she murmured, without allowing herself to appear desperate. I knew that if I showed too much hunger, too much fear, too much sadness, people would turn away. Because people are afraid of what is too real, but hunger was tightening and hands trembled. The sun was already beginning to punish his skin, leaving marks on his fragile shoulders. Even so, she insisted. In one hand, the bunch of flowers. In the other, the hope that someone would stop, look, and understand. He did not ask for compassion. He asked only for a chance. A fair exchange. Life for food. She stopped in front of an elegant restaurant where the tables were set with crystal, glasses and cloth napkins. He watched for a few moments. There was movement. Customers laughing, waiters coming and going, delicious smells escaping through the cracks. The girl's stomach turned. It was there. I had to try. And then she took a deep breath, straightened. The flowers, ran her hand over her dress to dust off and approached the entrance. In his head, an insistent thought, maybe someone will see it today. Maybe someone buys it. Maybe... But what she didn't know yet was that that moment, that simple approach, would be the turning point in her life. Because even without knowing it, even surrounded by indifference, something much bigger was about to happen. If you're feeling something in your chest, that's a good sign. It means that you still see what many prefer to ignore. So leave your Like on this video, subscribe to the channel and tell me here in the comments, from which city are you watching this story? The movement inside the restaurant contrasted violently with what happened outside. Inside, the atmosphere was a bubble of comfort. Waiters sliding between tables with elaborate dishes, loud laughter, cell phones on the table next to glasses of imported wine. The smell of freshly prepared food was almost provocative to whoever was on the other side of the glass, and on the other side was her, the barefoot girl, holding flowers as if holding the last chance to be seen. She stood for a few moments on the sidewalk, watching the scene with her eyes fixed on the people who were eating carefree. It was impossible not to feel the emptiness in my stomach increase, but even so, she took a deep breath, squeezed the flower stems more firmly between her fingers, and moved forward, hopeful. Her sweaty hands trembled a little, not for fear of being rejected, that she already knew, but for that childish, insistent desire that maybe this time it would be different. She knew that if someone there bought a flower, she would have food. Maybe I could even share it with another street kid later, as I sometimes did when luck was good. He passed the dark carpet of the entrance and stopped a few steps from the revolving door. Through the crack, she saw a well-dressed lady getting up from the table, calmly picking up her bag. She was walking towards the exit, alone. The girl decided to try. She pressed the flowers even more to her chest, straightened her hair with her other hand, and approached the door with slow steps. It was the perfect moment. The lady was leaving and she could offer a flower with delicacy, as she always did. But before he could say a single word, the strong arm of the security guard appeared between them. A sudden, dry movement without warning. He pushed her away with a brutality incompatible with the size and fragility of that child. The push wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, as if to say, with his body and with his eyes, that she did not belong there, that he had no right to be around. The impact was enough to knock her to the ground. The sound of the thin body hitting the sidewalk reverberated in the silence of those who saw it, but pretended not to see it. Flowers scattered, some crushed by hurried shoes. She stood there, not understanding. He sat down slowly, looking at the flowers as if they were pieces of something much larger that had broken. He didn't cry right away, not because it didn't hurt, it hurt too much, but because her body, already accustomed to contempt, was still trying to process what had just happened. No one approached. Not a single hand was reached. People just looked away as if her presence was uncomfortable, dirty, inconvenient. The security guard returned to the door indifferent, and the lady, the one who had been the target of the girl's hope, did not even notice what happened. He went out talking on the phone, laughing at something that seemed very far from the ground, where the child florist was trying to gather the remnants of her dignity. The city did not stop. The cars kept passing. The restaurant was still full, the waiters kept serving. Only she had stopped, not by choice, but because the push was more than physical. It was a push in the soul. For the first time in a long time, she felt something that burned more than hunger. Shame. Ashamed to have believed that she could be seen, of having dreamed, even if only for seconds, that someone would buy a flower. It was as if the world had once again given him a clear answer. You don't belong. The girl gathered one by one the fallen flowers, even those that were trampled on. Some had petals torn off, others were crumpled. But she did not give up on them. Perhaps because she saw in them a metaphor for herself, damaged, but still with something to offer. His hands trembled more now and his eyes began to fill, but she held back her tears. He had learned that in order to survive on the street, it was necessary to swallow what he feels. Feeling too much was dangerous. Showing pain was even more. So and then she curled up next to the wall, hugging the flowers as if they were the only thing left. People kept passing by, each immersed in their own world. No one asked what had happened. No one wanted to know his name. No one noticed the blank expression that took over her face at that moment. It wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper. It was the kind of pain that sets in when you lose even hope. The sidewalk was cold, despite the heat of the day. The flowers were dirty with dirt, and her fingertips had small open wounds. The contrast between the delicacy of what she held and the brutality of what she had just experienced was a scene that, If one really saw it, it would be impossible to forget. But almost everyone turned their faces away, almost all of them, except for someone who inside the restaurant had stopped chewing. A pair of eyes had witnessed it all, and that look, unlike the others, he did not ignore. He didn't deviate. He did not judge. He just noted, long, as if he saw more than his eyes could show. This silent, as yet unrevealed presence was beginning to move, and, unbeknownst to the girl, her fate was about to change, not by luck, but because of a gesture that was not born of pity, it was born of memory. And this meeting, improbable and silent, still had a lot to show. He was sitting at the central table, surrounded by executives and empty conversations about figures and goals, when the inner silence that had accompanied him for years was suddenly broken. Not because of anything that was said, but because of something that he saw, a movement outside the large glass window that took up the entire side of the restaurant. At the table, pretend laughter and forks jingling on expensive plates. On his face, a look that lost focus on what was ahead, and, stuck on the image outside, the girl lying on the ground, with the flowers scattered around her like shards of a gift that no one wanted to receive. There was something in that scene that pulled him hard, as if it tore him from reality and brought him face to face with something old, almost forgotten. The girl's hands, trembling as she collected the flowers one by one, seemed to repeat a gesture he knew well. On her back, hunched over with shame, there was a reflection of the child he had once been, a boy who also knew what it was to be invisible, who also knew the sidewalk as a bed floor and indifference as a soundtrack of childhood. The glass of wine in front of him remained untouched. The conversation continued without him, voices echoing meaninglessly. He could no longer hear anything but the muffled sound of cars outside and the sound of his heart pounding. Something inside him stirred violently, a discomfort that was not born of pity but of memory, of the silent connection between two stories that, for an instant, intersected there. One inside the glass, surrounded by luxury, the other, outside, surrounded by contempt. He couldn't tell if it was the way she held the flowers or the effort she made to hide her tears. Maybe it was the way she, even on the ground, still tried to protect what she was carrying. He saw her reach to collect a crushed flower and then stop for a second, observing its state, as if lamenting not for the object but for what it represented. It was much more than a crumpled flower. It was a symbol of what she herself was becoming in the eyes of the world, something beautiful but ignored. The image cut too deep. An old wound opened without asking permission. For a second he closed his eyes and found himself years earlier, smaller with the same dirty hands, trying to sell something on the street, trying to get noticed, trying to prove that he deserved to exist. That scene seemed like a repetition, an echo of what he believed he had left behind. But the past has a curious way of returning when you least expect it, and at that moment it came back with the face of a child who didn't even know he was being watched. He moved the chair slightly, as if the body had already been decided before the mind. The conversation at the table continued, but he was no longer there, not physically. That restaurant, with its neat cutlery, impeccable tablecloths, and plates that cost more than the girl might have seen in months, no longer made sense. For the first time in a long time he felt ashamed, not the girl, but of everything that surrounded him and that at that moment seemed so empty, so disproportionate, so cruel. There was a weight in his eyes that the other guests didn't notice. They were too busy praising the cuts of meat, the imported wines, the advertising campaigns. No one noticed the silence that formed around him. No one realized that. Even surrounded by people, he was completely alone. Alone with the memory of a pain that was never healed, only silenced. He stood up. Not in a hurry, but firmly. Like someone who knows he needs to do something, even without being sure what. He left the table without a word. His colleagues observed him strangely but did not ask. They did not dare to interrupt that movement. There was something about his expression that commanded respect, or maybe it was just the kind of pain that everyone recognizes but pretends not to see. He passed through the entrance of the restaurant, crossed the small hall and pushed the door, lightly. The sun hit him in the face, the warm air contrasted with the air-conditioned environment from which he came, but he didn't care. His eyes were looking for only one thing, and there she was, sitting on the sidewalk, hugging the bunch of flowers as if holding a piece of herself. His shoulders trembled slightly. She still tried to hide her tears. He stopped a few meters away, watching. I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want to look like another authoritarian presence. I just wanted to understand, see it up close. To confirm with her own eyes what her heart already knew. She needed to be seen. It needed to be recognized. And in some inexplicable way, he felt that he needed her too. The scene froze for a few seconds, as if time had slowed down. The noise of the cars became deep, the movement of the street blurry. There was only her, and he, two realities separated by different experiences, but by the same pain of origin. He took a deep breath, as if preparing his spirit for what was to come next, because at that moment everything would change, not by magic, not by chance, but for a decision that, although simple, carried the power to transform two worlds, a gesture that would not erase the past, but that could resignify it, and he was about to take that step. He approached slowly, as if respecting the sacred space of an exposed pain. Every step was careful, almost silent, not out of fear, but out of reverence. I knew that that kind of suffering is not invaded. He watched the girl's slight shoulders still tremble, even as she struggled to look strong. The flowers, once colorful and lush, now had the dull tone of someone who had been ignored for too long. The girl held them with one hand, and with the other she protected her own body, huddled like a frightened animal before the world. When he finally stopped before her, the girl's eyes rose slowly, trying to understand who this man was. There was no expression of authority on his face. There was also no mercy. It was something different, a rare kind of silent compassion without exaggeration, without posturing, that just looks and understands. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. For a few seconds, the silence between the two was more eloquent than any words, and then, in one simple motion, he ducked down. Her knees touched the floor of the dirty sidewalk, and with firm and delicate hands, began to collect the flowers along with her. That for the girl was a bigger shock than the push she had received minutes before. No one had ever done that. No one has ever knelt next to her for anything. Most people didn't even stop to ask if she was okay. And there he was, in a suit, an expensive watch, clean shoes, kneeling in the dirt, helping her pick flowers that the city had trampled on. She didn't know if she could trust her. He had learned not to trust kind gestures. Often they were followed by promises that were never fulfilled, or even worse, by obligations. But there was something about him that broke that defense. Maybe it was the silence, or the way he didn't look at her as if she were less. He simply saw her. This in itself was already a miracle. After they had collected all the flowers, or at least what was left of them, he reached toward the small bundle and, without hesitation, took the money out of his wallet. He did not ask how much it cost. He didn't bargain. He just paid as someone who recognizes the value of something that others do not see. The girl, still suspicious, hesitated to take the money. His eyes moved from side to side, as if looking for an invisible trap. But there was no trap, just an outstretched and sincere hand, and then, with an even more unexpected gesture, he pointed to the restaurant, not with authority, but with a mute invitation. She looked at him as someone who doesn't understand the other's language. His feet did not belong on that porcelain floor. His clothes did not match the linen towels, and the smell of food escaping through the doors was like a cruel reminder of where she shouldn't be. But he did not back down. He just waited. Maybe it was hunger, maybe it was the look, maybe it was the fatigue of running away. But she got up, slowly, still hugging the flowers, as if she needed something between her and the world. She took her first steps hesitantly, hoping that someone would come to stop her, as she always did. But no one came, and together they entered. The contrast was immediate. The fresh air from the air conditioner touched her skin like an almost magical relief. The eyes took time to get used to the soft lighting, the brightness of the cutlery, the ambient music. Everything there seemed to be part of another universe, one where she had never stepped before. And now she was there, accompanied by a stranger who treated her not as a nuisance but as legitimate company. The looks came, of course. Looks that tried to disguise their discomfort, looks that judged in silence, that tried to understand what a poorly dressed child was doing sitting at one of the most expensive tables in the city. But he didn't bother. And little by little, the girl also began to allow herself not to shrink so much. The waiter approached, confused, but didn't dare question. She received the menu with trembling hands, but she couldn't read everything that was there. So he made the request for her. A simple but hot dish. When the food arrived, the girl hesitated before touching the cutlery. There was something ceremonial about that moment, as if eating there was more than feeding the body. It was almost a baptism, a silent ceremony of acceptance. He took the first bite carefully, then another, and another, until hunger spoke louder than embarrassment. He ate as someone who gives back to the body the right to exist. With each bite, something inside her rebuilt itself, and little by little, that face hardened by abandonment began to soften. Don't smile, not yet. But there was a new sparkle in his eyes, a glow that had been faded for a long time. As he ate, he looked around. I watched the lights, the paintings, the coming and going of the waiters. It was as if I was trying to memorize all that, to engrave in memory, as if wanting to keep a rare memory. That was not an ordinary day. That was a moment of respite within a life of suffocation. And she knew it, even without understanding everything that was happening. The man didn't talk much. He only watched her carefully, not as one who expects gratitude, but as one who wants to understand. There was a lightness to his gestures, a patience that seemed to say, you can take as long as you want. And she felt it. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to run. He didn't have to hide. I didn't have to apologize for being there. The plate was empty, and with her stomach warmed, something else warmed up inside her. A part that had been forgotten, the part that still believed there was a place in the world where it could fit. I didn't know if that moment would last. I didn't know if it was real. But in that instant, as brief as it was, she felt human again. He ran his fingers slowly over the edge of the plate, as if trying to prolong the feeling of fullness. His eyes turned to him. There was still mistrust, of course, but now there was also something new, a spark, a start. A question changes in the air. Why was he doing that? The answer would not yet come. But the gesture had already been made. And from then on, everything that was previously predictable would begin to change, even if she didn't know it yet. Time does not come back. But sometimes it starts again in an unexpected way. And that night, without a doubt, would be the silent mark of a new story. The fork rested next to the empty plate, and the girl's body seemed lighter, as if the weight of the empty stomach had momentarily transferred itself to the surrounding air. She felt warm from the inside out, not only by the hot food she hadn't tasted in a long time, but by a sensation so rare that she almost couldn't name it: relief. She looked around with the same silent admiration as someone who sees herself, for a moment, in an awakened dream. Every detail of that room was new to her. The glow of light reflecting off the white dishes, the sound of running water coming from the kitchen in the background, the smell of fresh coffee being passed in some corner. It was as if the world gained another texture inside, softer, less rough. The man still watched her with the same patient attention. It was a silence that did not pressure, did not demand, just allowed. And it was in this serene interval that she let go of her shoulders, let her body relax in the upholstered chair, and for the first time in days, perhaps weeks, took a deep breath without fear. He still held the flowers, now arranged again, although marked by the trampling of the street. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was attachment, but that was still hers. It was still what was left of the day that almost broke it. Without raising his voice or invading, he asked. A simple question, but one that carried a world inside, where she lived. The girl averted her eyes, suspicious. The gesture was almost automatic. He learned early on that questions can be traps, and that truth sometimes costs more than silence, but something about him made her want to respond. maybe because of the way he waited without haste, as someone who accepts that sincere answers are not extracted, they are offered. He lowered his eyes to his own lap, where his fingers moved the stems of the flowers as if they wanted to gain courage. And then, in a low, almost inaudible voice, she let slip what her heart already knew, but her lips rarely confessed. She had nowhere to live. Since his parents were gone, the street had become everything. He slept wherever he could. Under marquees, on park benches, inside abandoned buses that have become shelters for others like her. Sometimes I would find a corner in a hostel. Other times, nothing. Just the hard ground and the fear. She spoke with long pauses, as if rummaging through a past she preferred to forget. It described the cold nights, when the wind seemed to pierce the bones, the rainy days when the shoes were soaked and there was nowhere to dry the clothes. She spoke of the dark places where she hid, the noises that made her tremble at night, the eyes that followed her with intentions that she did not yet fully understand but already recognized as dangerous. He spoke of the cold of indifference, the cold that is not felt on the skin but that freezes inside. He also told about the others, children like her, boys who fled violent homes, girls who were left behind by families who didn't know what to do with one more mouth to feed. They formed fragile bonds, alliances of occasion, a kind of shared survival. Sometimes they exchanged food, sometimes they fought over a dry place. But there was, at the bottom of it all, a common feeling. The world did not see them. And when he did, it was usually to push them back into the unseen. The man listened to her in absolute silence. He did not interrupt. He did not react with exaggerated expressions. I just listened. And as she spoke, his eyes remained fixed, steady, but not cold. It was as if every word of hers unearthed something inside him, something he believed he had overcome, buried under layers of success, deals, contracts, and dinners like that. But there was no shield that could resist the truth spoken by a hungry child. That pierced any armor. She talked about the days when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, when the legs trembled with weakness and the eyes weighed too much, in which the only thing that made her follow was the memory of her mother's perfume or the sound of her father's voice singing softly at night. Small memories that she struggled to keep alive, even if they were slowly disappearing, like drawings in the sand carried away by the tide. When she finished, there were no tears, neither in her nor in him. It was as if that conversation had happened on another plane, where crying had no place, but the pain was felt with full force, a place where everything was raw, real, without masks. He remained silent, but inside something had already moved. A strange impulse, unexpected, but strong enough to be impossible to ignore. I knew at that moment that I couldn't let her go. It was not heroism. It was not charity. It was something else, something deeper, more intimate, a kind of reunion with a version of himself that was left behind. And when he looked at her, dirty, thin, with firm hands holding battered flowers, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, his own past, not as a distant memory, but as a living presence before your eyes. The girl ended her story with a sigh, an almost imperceptible sound, but loaded with everything he didn't say. And at that moment, without her knowing, a decision had already been born within that man, unannounced, unplanned, but decisive. With the same firmness with which one day, as a boy, he had promised himself that, if he ever had the chance, he would do it differently. And now there, maybe that chance had finally come. That night, as the lights of the city flickered through the windows of the restaurant and the last customers said goodbye in a hurry, he remained there, sitting in front of her, as if he understood that something too big had just been born in silence. There were no promises made or concrete plans drawn up there, but the gesture was made and the seed was planted. What was drawn in the air was something that could not be explained with words, it was only felt. The certainty that that story would not end at that table. The girl looked at him with a mixture of relief and caution. His body still carried the vices of survival, his eyes attentive to any sudden movement, his shoulders tense as if they were always waiting for a blow. But there was a breather, a rare moment when fear did not rule everything. Outside, night was falling heavy on the city. The cold sidewalk, which a few hours before had been the scene of humiliation, was now far away. For the first time in a long time, she knew she wouldn't have to go back to a dirty, dark corner. The man, with a discreet gesture, had already called a trusted driver. He didn't want that moment to be interrupted by looks, judgments, or bureaucracies. He just wanted to make sure she was taken to a safe place. And so it was. Inside the car, the girl leaned her head against the glass and watched the lights pass, quickly, as if the world was spinning too fast for her to understand. But he did not fight against it. He just let himself go. The address where they went was simple, discreet, far from the neighborhoods she used to circulate, but still welcoming. When he entered, he didn't know if he should take off his shoes or if he was allowed to sit on the sofa. He looked at everything as if invading a world of others, apologizing for breathing. But he reassured her with small gestures. A blanket spread, a glass of water on the table, a soft light in the hallway. Details that seemed banal, but that in her life were unheard of. That was not a luxury. He was careful. And care, for her, it was a foreign language. The first few nights were difficult. Even on a soft mattress, she was slow to sleep. The silence of the house was strange. Accustomed to the noise of cars, the nocturnal voices and the footsteps of other homeless people, the absence of sound made her alert. She woke up afraid, frightened by her own rest. He had nightmares. Sometimes I screamed softly in my sleep. But he was always around, not invading, just present. Gradually, she began to loosen up. The following days were filled with new things. A hot bath with no time limit, clean clothes which still smelled of soap, a toothbrush of her own, a plate, with food at every meal, the simple gesture of being able to repeat the rice without having to beg, a closet with illustrated books that she still couldn't read completely, but that she opened with curiosity. There were toys, but at first she didn't know what to do with them. It was as if her body was still adjusting to a world where it was. Allowed to play, smile, belong. He began to teach things little by little. How to write your own name, how to use cutlery without fear of making mistakes, how to style your hair without rushing. One day, he placed in front of her a box of brand new colored pencils with blank sheets next to it. She looked at it as if staring at a relic, then took the pencil gently and drew flowers. The same flowers that he carried in the dirty bundle on that afternoon of pushing and neglect. But now they were colorful, lush, smiling on paper. It was there that the transformation began. But not everything was easy. The news that he had taken in a street girl spread among neighbors and colleagues. Some thought it was beautiful, others strange. Some praised it, others were suspicious. There were those who asked why she didn't look for an institutional shelter, why she got so involved, why complicate her own life. He listened patiently, but he did not back down. He knew what he was doing. More than that, he knew why he was doing it. Because at the bottom of his silence there was a truth that no one else knew, a debt to the past, a commitment to one's own history. Over time he provided the legal procedures. He sought lawyers, filled out papers, talked to social workers. It wasn't fast, nor simple, but it was possible. She got provisional custody, and then, at each evaluation, reinforced what was already clear to anyone who wanted to see it. That girl now had a home, and in the process, something about her also began to change. If before his steps were short and suspicious, now he walked more firmly. He still looked over his shoulder from time to time, but he was already smiling without fear. At school it took him a while to fit in. His classmates were surprised by his quiet manner, his limited vocabulary, his simple clothes. But she was smart. He had a thirst for learning that impressed the teachers. Gradually he began to participate in activities, raise his hand in class, make shy friends. He discovered that he liked science, that he loved to observe plants, understand how they grew, where they came from. He spent hours in the garden of the house, stirring the soil, planting seeds, taking care of pots. It was as if it connected her with something that had always existed inside her, but that never had room to flourish. Dreams, once silent and kept under lock and key, now began to be whispered in the late afternoon. One day, he said he wanted to have a flower shop, not to sell on the street, but a beautiful store with a good smell where people would enter and feel happy. Another time she said she wanted to help other children like her, who knew exactly what a homeless child needed to hear in order not to give up. And when she said that, the man who was listening to her from the balcony just smiled. He knew that this was the greatest sign of healing, the ability to dream not only of one's own good, but of the good of others. The months passed with a quiet rhythm, like the seasons that change imperceptibly until one day everything blooms, and she was now able to look in the mirror and recognize herself as someone whole. There were still scars. Some brands don't disappear, but they are no longer open wounds. They became reminders of all that she had won to be there. And he, the man who once saw her on the other side of the window, knew that no decision, no matter how risky, was in vain. Because in every little gesture, in every step forward, in every smile that was born without warning, she showed that there were flowers inside her waiting only for a chance to be born. The mornings in that house began to take on an almost ritualistic rhythm. The sound of the children's alarm clock echoed lightly, followed by the small footsteps of her coming down the stairs with her hair still unkempt and her eyes still getting used to the daylight. The kitchen already smelled of fresh bread, brewed coffee, and something harder to describe, the smell of permanence. She sat at the table with her school uniform still a little baggy, but her shoulders already more erect. The fork no longer trembled as it had the first few times. She now ate without fear, with the appetite of those who know there will be more. He, always with the folded newspaper next to him, made a point of listening to his stories from school, classmates, books. Every detail mattered, because he knew what it meant to have no one to tell what he was experiencing. What she didn't yet know, and perhaps didn't even suspect, was that every gesture of care he offered came from a much deeper place than simple generosity. That was not charity. It never was. It was a way of giving back something that he himself had received when he least expected it. She saw in him only the firm man, a restaurateur, polite, with polished shoes and a car that seemed to float in the streets. But he didn't know that, underneath the lined clothes, there were scars sewn by time, and behind that calm gaze, there was a hidden story, buried for many years under the rush of life, but now before her, it resurfaced with a clarity impossible to ignore. As a child, he also knew the hard ground. She grew up in a house too small for the siblings she housed, where the empty closets forced her mother's creativity, and her father's silence weighed more than any scolding. There were no toys, no parties, no plans. There was only what was necessary, and often not even that. At school, he was the boy with the shabby clothes and the empty lunchbox. He learned early not to ask for anything, not to expect too much, going unnoticed. It was as a child that he began to work. He delivered bags to the market, cleaned cars on the corner, helped in a bakery in the cold mornings. He never complained. He learned to be useful so as not to be discarded. Fatigue became part of the body, as if it were born with it every morning. But even in the midst of the hard routine, there was an uneasiness within him, something that pulsated, a silent desire to change one's destiny. And that desire grew day after day, even when everything around seemed to scream the opposite. It was on one of these early mornings, while scrubbing the floor of an elderly man's bakery, that his life began to change. The man watched him in silence, as if he saw something beyond the dirt on his hands and the torn slippers on his feet. One day, she asked him if he could read. He responded with a timid but determined yes. From then on, every night, after work, that baker began to teach simple things, new words, accounts, stories. With an old notebook and a half-finished pencil, the boy discovered the power of knowledge. And more than that, he discovered that someone had believed him. That baker didn't adopt him. It did not lift him out of poverty, but he saw it, and that was enough for him to start changing the course of his own path. He studied, worked, fell, got up. There were closed doors, turned faces, sleepless nights, but she never forgot the look of that man who in silence gave her permission to dream. And it was with this memory that he built everything he has, brick by brick, plate by plate. Conquest for conquest, Now sitting in front of that girl who could one day have been him, he saw all this as a cycle that was closing. She didn't know it, but every word she said rekindled a dormant memory in him. Every fear she described he had already known. Every retreat of hers he had already lived. The way she looked around before serving herself, how hesitant she was when she received affection, how slow she was to trust. All that was all too familiar. And that was exactly why he couldn't let her go through life like he almost did. Invisible. The decision to take her in was not an isolated act. It was a natural response to all that he had been. It was not a rescue, but a mirror. Every day when she smiled more openly, when she memorized new words, when she wrote complete sentences in her school notebooks, he felt that somehow he was also rescuing the boy who once stayed in the bakery, scrubbing the floor and waiting for someone to notice him. There were nights when he would stay awake a little longer, watching through the crack in the door her room, now decorated with light curtains, colorful throw pillows and shelves filled with books. She slept huddled up as if she still kept the remnants of the past, but on his face there was a trace of peace, that peace that he one day also sought. And there, in the silence of the corridor, he understood that some wounds are not healed with medicine, but with presence, that some voids are not filled with things, but with gestures, and that the greatest gift someone can receive is not a roof or a bed, but the certainty that there is someone who truly cares. The past he hid so much now made sense. Not as pain, but as a bridge. And she, without knowing it, was the link between what he was and what he could still be. Because sometimes life gives us back what it has taken, not in the same hands, not in the same way, but in the form of a mission. And in this man there was a clear mission, never again to allow another child to pass through the world without being seen. And she was the beginning of it all. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks slowly shaped into months. The house, once inhabited by adult routines and prolonged silences, now breathed another time. There was the sound of pencils scratching the paper in the late afternoon, the conversations about homework over dinner, and the restrained smiles that revealed themselves in small daily victories. The girl no longer hid in the corners of the house as before. His body, once hunched by uncertainty, now walked more upright through the corridors, as if he finally believed that this was his place. She began to develop a special relationship with the garden of the house. It was almost like a secret shrine, where I spent hours observing, learning, testing. He planted seeds carefully, marked the time of germination, wrote down the growth of the leaves in notebooks. Gradually he created his own language with the earth, with the wind, with the silent cycle of plants. He learned that each flower has its time, that some grow too fast and fall apart quickly, while others require waiting and care, but bloom with double strength. Those lessons seemed to speak about herself. The school, which at first was a challenge made up of curious looks and veiled questions, became a fertile ground for discoveries. She had a thirst for learning, not out of obligation, but because understanding the world was the only way to rebuild one's own. He began to stand out, especially in areas where he could use his hands and his watchful eye. Science, art, biology. The botany professor noticed his unusual talent for recognizing species and understanding natural cycles, and it was he who encouraged her to think further, to dream of something beyond the classroom. At the end of high school, she was no longer the girl who entered that school with fear for the first time. He was someone who, despite the marks of the past, knew exactly what he wanted. When he graduated, he did not make emotional speeches or seek applause. She just smiled, held her diploma firmly, and glanced at the audience, where that man, her silent guardian, watched her with teary eyes, proud in silence. They didn't need words. Everything had already been said between the lines of coexistence in the years of sharing and transformation. It was around this same time that she began to think about her own path. I didn't want to simply follow a profession. I wanted to build something with purpose, something that made sense to her, and that, in some way, also made sense to the world. He returned to the garden more often. He began to grow flowers with more intention, to study cultivation techniques, to understand how small businesses worked. He took courses, researched suppliers, studied marketing. Each step was a silent stepping stone toward something greater. One day, he decided, he would open his own flower shop, not out of vanity, but because he felt it was the most faithful way to honor his own history. There was something deeply symbolic in transforming what once represented pain and humiliation into a source of beauty and hope. Each flower he would sell would not be just an arrangement. It would be a reminder that anything can flourish, even when it is born on the asphalt. Choosing. The name of the flower shop was not difficult. In her heart, there was only one possible option. The name of the flower she was carrying that day she was pushed to the ground, the same one that fell, shattered, but was picked up with trembling hands and hope intact. It was the perfect symbol of one's own trajectory, something fragile but impossible to destroy, something that stands up, even after it has been crushed. The space chosen was small, modest, but full of light. It had large windows, light walls, and shelves that, little by little, were filled with colors. She took care of every detail herself. The choice of pots, the arrangement of the plants, the ambient soundtrack. She created an environment where each customer felt welcomed, where the smell of flowers had the power to calm down, to open up good memories. He wanted each person who passed by to take with him more than one bouquet. I wanted him to take a story, even if he didn't know it. But the real purpose of the place went beyond the sale. From day one, she made it clear that she wanted to give opportunity to others like herself. Young people in vulnerable situations, invisible at traffic lights, at bus stops, on the streets where no one looks twice. She began to hire teenagers who, like her once was, needed someone who would believe. He trained, guided, cared for, and he saw in them the same sparkle that one day reappeared in his own eyes. Floriculture grew. It gained prominence in the neighborhood, then in the city. Not because it is the largest, but because it is the most human. It won loyal customers, praise in local reports, and, most importantly, new stories that were born among the shelves. Stories of overcoming, of new beginnings, of flowers that sprouted from unexpected terrain. She, now an adult, carried with her the same sensitivity as the girl who sold flowers on the street, but with a strength that only those who have faced second attempt know how to cultivate. It was common to see her at the counter of the store, organizing arrangements with steady hands, always with a keen eye for detail. Sometimes I'd stop to talk to an older client, offer a flower to a child, or help one of the young people on the team start over after a mistake. His gaze was always generous, but firm. As someone who understands that compassion is not about pity, but about respect. And then one late afternoon the scene repeated itself, but in a whole new way. She left the store with a flower in her hands, the same flower he carried on that distant day. Only now, it is erected with pride. His feet, which had once walked the streets in fear and cold, were now firmly on the sidewalk, in front of the store that bore the name of his transformed pain. The sun gilded her hair, the wind passed lightly, and she, when she looked at that flower, didn't just see a plant. He saw her entire story, and the certainty that there were flowers inside that no one could ever crush. She no longer went unnoticed on the streets. The orphan girl, once invisible to the eyes of the city, was now recognized by where she went, not for what she owned, but for what she represented. It was as if her story had taken root, not only in the vases of her flower shop, but also in the hearts of those who knew her, even if from afar. And the scope of this was beyond what she herself could have imagined. The gesture of a man who once knelt beside her to pick flowers fell like a seed on fertile soil, and germinated in 1,000 different directions. Her presence on social networks began discreetly, with photos of the flowers, cultivation tips, short phrases that mixed nature and reflection. But it was when she decided to share, albeit delicately, fragments of her own trajectory that everything changed. His followers multiplied. People of all ages began to comment, to send messages, to tell that his words had healed wounds that they did not even know how to name. There was something about the way she spoke that touched deeply. There was no pose, there was no emotional makeup. It was pure truth, transformed into hope. She began to be invited to community events, school fairs, lectures at NGOs. He sat in front of audiences made up of frightened young people, exhausted parents, discredited educators. And instead of giving lessons, he told stories. He talked about the nights he spent in marquees, about the trampled flowers, about the feeling of being hungry and afraid at the same time. But not as someone who displays scars. She spoke as if offering maps. It showed that it was possible to transform pain into direction. That wound is not a sentence, and that there is always an after, even if life insists on saying no. In each school he visited, he left something planted. Not only in the gardens, she helped organize with the students, but within each child who listened to her. She told her story as if telling a real fable, where the villain was not a monster, but neglect, and where the hero was the one who dared to look. Each child left, with the feeling that being noticed could be the beginning of everything. Many said they wanted to be like her when they grew up. Others, who wanted to change what they saw on the streets of the city itself. And that was the goal. She didn't want anyone to look up to her. I wanted everyone to believe, and then came the social projects. With the support of local partners, she created a training program for homeless teenagers where they learned about plants, sales, organization. It was not a course to teach how to set up flower shops, but to teach how to take care of oneself, of others, of time, of life. It was the same care that had once been offered to her, a cycle that was completed with each young person who got their first job, with each smile that was born in place of an old fear. The articles began to appear in local newspapers, then in magazines, until they reached television. But none of that changed her. He continued to arrive early at the flower shop, organizing pots, watering the plants with the same calm as before. He continued to listen to the stories of the customers, welcoming the pains that passed through the door, as if he understood that everyone carries their storms. His secret was not in fame. He was in the presence. Often someone would pass by the store and say they just wanted to see who she was, that he had no intention of buying anything, he just wanted to look into the eyes of those who turned abandonment into shelter. And she always received it with the same simplicity, because he knew that the biggest flower he could offer was the look he once received, the chance that was once given to him. That was what moved her. The desire to be for others, what I wish I had found when I was still that girl sitting on the floor with shattered flowers in her arms. And she succeeded. With every word, every action, every gesture. His story was no longer about pain, but about bridge. She no longer carried the label of orphan. It carried the title of living inspiration. Not because he won in life, but because he won in visibility. Because he chose to transform what was once absence into a shelter. And in each lecture, in each post, in each flower delivered with her own hands, she repeated, sometimes out loud, sometimes just with her eyes, that the gesture of a single person can change destinies, that it doesn't take much. All it takes is a true look, a plate of hot food, an attentive ear, a safe space. Humanity fits into small acts. And it was one of those acts, almost forgotten in the rush of any afternoon, that drew an entire future where before there was only dust. She was still there, standing firm, with her roots now very deep. He carried the past with respect, but without weight. She knew that the flower she held in the window of her store was much more than an ornament. It was memory, promise, and 1,000 possibilities. And each person who passed by and heard his story left carrying a little of this certainty, that even when all seems lost, someone can see. And when someone sees it, for real, the world changes. Because that's how futures begin, and she was living proof of that. She was on the ground, the flowers scattered, the eyes lowered, the world passing in a hurry. And right there, in that instant of silent pain, something began to sprout. What seemed like the end, a child pushed, rejected, forgotten, was, in fact, the first trace of a story that had not even begun yet, because it didn't break, neither the flower nor the girl. It did, yes. It withered a little. But he got up, and when she got up, she carried with her everything that the world said was little and showed that it was exactly enough to transform destinies. Sometimes life pushes hard, and there is not always someone to reach out. But all it takes is a look that truly sees, a gesture that is born from the heart, for everything to begin to change. This story is a reminder that empathy still flourishes, of what courage can it grow in the soil of pain, and that our choices, no matter how small they may seem, can design someone's future. If you've come this far, it's because something of this story touched inside. So take advantage and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot of history like this made to remind you that there is still beauty where you least expect it. Leave a like on this video if this connection reached you in any way. And tell me in the comments, write, "This flower was me," so I know that you stayed until the end and felt it with me. There is a video here on the side that tells a similar story, one of those that slowly warms the chest. Click and stay with me there. The next flower is already about to bloom.